the NHS doesn't know how many patients who've been admitted are fully vaccinated.
Have a great session, Stuart. You are live.
We're live. Okay, well, thank you, Albert, and once again, if I may, pay tribute to Albert for bringing us all together, and we look forward to being all together in Jerusalem next year. But again, we'll deal with it as we have done online. And this session is fascinating, and no more fascinating because the people who are going to be speaking, who I will introduce in a minute, we're going to be talking about Iran. But in framing the question that I want to kick off with, I was looking this morning, not that I do it every morning, at the Tehran Times of today with a map of Israel, which is very nice of them to put a map of Israel with all sorts of pinpoints of where population centers, and the headline saying just one wrong move, with a minor headline: threat and pressure do not work on Iran. So this is today's front page of Tehran Times. I'm going to start by kicking off by suggesting what is going on. Are they particularly worried, or is this just part of the game? Now, for those all watching, we have a really distinguished panel. We have Ambassador Mark Regev, former ambassador to the UK. Of course, he straddles all, having been brought up in Melbourne and lives in Israel. So when it comes to the Australia-UK-Israel dialogue, he personifies it. So we've got Ambassador Mark Regev, we've got Mike Gates, a former Labour MP, former member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, former chairman of it, if I'm not mistaken. We have Liam Fox, who has been a senior cabinet minister, is a great commentator on all of this, has written books on many things, and most recently has become the chairman of the UK Friends of the Abraham Accords, invited by the 3 ambassadors in the UK. We have my friend Boaz Ganor, who, if I don't see him in Tel Aviv, I see him at Chelsea, but Liverpool are still doing better. And welcome Michael Danby, former member of Parliament for Melbourne and leader of the Jewish community. So I go back to the front page of the Tehran Times, just one wrong move. Mark, where are we at?
Well, I think we're at a worrying moment, if you don't mind me saying. I'm not going to be a man of great hope and optimism today, because I'm worried. And I think many Israelis are worried as we speak, because it's not looking good. The recent IAEA report was stark. For a nuclear weapon, you need different ingredients. But the major factor, the most difficult hurdle, is stockpiling enough enriched uranium. And according to the IAEA, forget Israel, they're just weeks away from having enough enriched uranium for a bomb. Weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. Now, it's true they need to work on weaponization and they need to work on delivery systems, but they have almost, on the very threshold of having enough enriched uranium for a bomb, and this is a serious problem. And we are concerned in Israel that the international community its eyes are on different balls. They're concerned about what's going on in China. They're concerned about what's going on in Russia. There's a crisis on the border between Russia and the Ukraine. China is China. And because of all this, we are concerned that there are some in the international community that just, let's put the Iranian file in the freezer, so to speak. Let's put the Iranian file to sleep because we've got bigger fish to fry. And unfortunately, we could see that what's going on now, these talks, we see a possible very negative outcome. People are saying, well, it looks like we won't get a deal, so we'll have to go for less for less. But less for less means maintaining the Iranian status, according to the IAEA, which is they're just weeks away from having enough nuclear weapon for a bomb. That's not a status quo. That is sustainable.
Well, I'm going to turn to Liam because Liam has spoken about these things for a long time. I mean, we are clearly, Liam, getting to sort of the sort of midnight hour here. What should be the actions of the British government and Americans, or what should they be doing at this point, taking on board exactly what Mark has just said?
Well, the one thing that we shouldn't be is surprised. And I was opposed to the JCPOA back in 2015 for a number of reasons that I think are material today. First of all, that it reduced the ambition. Rather than stopping Iran developing a nuclear weapon, it effectively delayed it for 15 years. It led to the potential for a rapid breakout by Iran if it was unhappy at any point with what was happening. It didn't stop the development of Iran's ballistic missile system, which of course is in breach of UN resolutions. It didn't deal with Iran's regional activity, and it was unable to fulfill the agreement on trade, even if Iran had met all its obligations, which it was never going to do. It lifted sanctions too quickly and gave Iran a huge lot of money, which actually went into its more malign activities in the region. They have not complied with the agreements on uranium. And I think that if you look at what's been happening domestically in Iran, the situation's actually deteriorated. Just when you couldn't think it could get worse politically, you get Raisi coming along, and that's even worse than we've had before. And that's before you take into account that the IRGC now have pretty much total control of the means of production, and that even a change in political leadership may not actually result in anything on the ground fundamentally changing. So I am pessimistic. I think that that we need to redouble our efforts on sanctions, and we do need to maintain maximal pressure on Iran and those who still do business with Iran. But I think that we have got into a position that's disadvantageous, and I have to say, largely of our own making.
Well, thank you. I want to turn to you, Mike, for a moment, but if I could just raise the point that some people have raised, in that within newish, it's not that new anymore, American administration, it seemed like, and I don't know if it's true, and Mike, you might have a view, that many of the key people that negotiated the clearly poor JCPOA deal of 2015 are sort of back in leadership positions, same guys, same people at the forefront. Does this not augur well, Mike?
I don't think so, because the context is different. We aren't in a pre-2018 period. The Trump administration's decision to withdraw from the deal has allowed the Iranians to not be constrained, even though there were problems, and Liam's right about the original JCPOA. What the Iranians have done is they've taken advantage of that withdrawal, and therefore the context that we're dealing with today is far worse than it would have been if the JCPOA had continued. And Mark referred to a few weeks. I can recall, I went to Iran in 2006, 2007, with the Foreign Affairs Committee. And even in those days, we were talking about 18 months for a breakout capability. And that was when the E3 foreign ministers, and Jack Straw was the UK foreign minister, were trying to engage the Iranians to stop the nuclear program. And that subsequently, many years later, led to the agreement in 2015. I think we are in a worse position now. And that the sanctions, the maximum pressure that the US exerted under Trump hasn't worked either. Iran's malign behavior in Syria, the attacks on Saudi Arabia, the other activities have continued, and they are now potentially much closer to a breakout than they were before. And I agree, the situation is very bleak, and the news from Vienna is that potentially they're basically wanting to pocket what they've done and say, take all your sanctions off, and then we'll start talking about constraints. Now, that is not a credible position for anyone, but we are where we are because of mistakes we made. And I think the Trump withdrawal, this may not be popular with everybody in Israel, given that it was Netanyahu's policy, but I think the Trump withdrawal was a serious error.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, the consensus here is we're in a bad position. I'm going to turn to you, Michael, before coming to Boaz. Michael Danby. I mean, if things are as bleak as has just been suggested by the previous three speakers, my question is now, okay, well, if that's the position we're in, whatever's happened before, right or wrong, what happens now? What should the West, what should we all be doing? Michael Danby.
The next step is to the International Atomic Energy Agency governing board. The Americans surely have to, if the Vienna talks fail, have to put pressure on the IAEA to submit a report to the Security Council that Iran is in violation of its fissile uranium agreements. And I think we sort of have to go down this diplomatic pressure route. The outcome of such a recommendation from the governing board ought to be that the Security Council therefore reimposes snapback sanctions on the Iranians. Now, of course, with Russia and China sitting there, we know that that's not going to happen. But in order to take further steps, you have to take interim steps in order to prepare international public opinion for anything further that might be done. Surely that has to happen. Now, of course, we have the problem that we've got Maley and Sherman, the two architects of this bad idea in the beginning, are still there. But if the new hardline Iranian leadership refuses all offers at Vienna, and I think they will, even they will try the diplomatic route of pressure through the International Atomic Energy Agency. And then we come to what happens beyond that. I'm not sure that Israel is 100 foot tall. I have never been more optimistic about its future demographically, technologically, economically, etc. But it's 2 countries away. It's allegedly 80 sites. And I don't know whether the Israelis have the key piece of technology, that is the monster bunker busting bomb that the Americans have, but I'm not sure that they've supplied them to the Israelis that would enable a successful military action. After the failure at the Security Council of a IAEA recommendation, however, the Americans alone could reimpose snapback sanctions. And that's by using things like the International Monetary Credit System, SWIFT, etc., to impose even tougher sanctions. So they're the next steps, but I agree with everyone else that it's a bleak picture.
So thank you. Let me turn to Boaz. I mean, each day, each minute, the few minutes that we've been discussing, the efforts go on in Iran to get what it is that they clearly want to get. Boaz, you've been at this for a long time. You've been saying things for a long time. We are getting to a really key moment. And I throw it out there. My concern is there's often too much talking and too much diplomatic, whatever it may be, and hope that we do this and hope we do that, but all the time the wheels are turning. Boaz.
First of all, Stuart, you know what's torturing an Israeli is letting him speak in the last speaker in the first round. So I was tortured, but at the same time, I got the benefit to listen to my esteemed colleagues and agree with all of them actually. And what I would like to do is to tie what we heard from the previous speakers into one concept that I would like to introduce to this distinguished panel. And for doing that, let me share with you two anecdotes that I personally were involved in. The first one was in 2009. I was invited to the White House to have a talk with the new coming head of the National Security Council of United States, General Jim Jones. This was few months after Obama was elected and he was nominated to his position. And when I got to the building and I met Jim, he surprised me with a question that I didn't expect. He asked me, would a yellow light be enough for Israel to make the decision to attack Iran? I was really surprised, and I said, first of all, let me be modest. Who am I that you are asking this question? I'm a counterterrorism expert, a scholar. I'm not an Israeli official. Why are you interested in what I'm thinking? He said, look, I'm asking those questions, the official bodies. I'm interested in your views as a scholar. Would a yellow light be enough for Israel to make a decision to attack Iran? My answer was back then, and it's even truer today. I said to him, you know what? Even a green light should not be enough for Israel to make such a decision. Then he was crushed. And he said, what? Really? If United States is giving a green light to Israel to make a decision to attack Iran, you think that Israel should not attack Iran? I said, of course. And you know why? Because of three reasons. The first reason, it has to do with what Michael just said, because I'm not an Air Force expert, and I don't know exactly what is the Israeli Air Force capabilities, but I tend to believe the Iranians have learned a lot from the Israeli bombing of the nuclear facility in Syria, Iraq, and therefore they have many facilities scattered all over Iran and being in depth, deep in the soil, and Israel would need probably all its air force with special capabilities, as Michael was mentioning, in order to do what? Even if it would be successful, I tend to believe that Israel will not destroy the nuclear capability of Iran. It would harm them, maybe severely harm the facilities, and it will drag Iran a year earlier, 2 years, 3 years. But what would happen the day after? They would run for the bomb with the official excuse that they have been attacked by Israel, and that's why they need to protect themselves with a nuclear capability. That's the first reason. The second reason, and that I know very well because I investigated and researched that for many years, I know exactly what would happen in Israel the day after. And this would be unleashing Hezbollah capabilities, rocket capability and missile capability, which holds more than 150,000 rockets and missiles today that cover all the territory of Israel. We, in the research that we conduct at the Institute for Counterterrorism, believe that they would present about somewhere between 2,500 up to 3,000 rockets a day, multiple that in the numbers of days, probably dozens of days that we would have this war being conducted. And that would inflict somewhere between 100 to 200 destruction areas, i.e. buildings that collapse in a day, on a day. That's an unprecedented challenge to the Israeli home front. It's almost resembled to a nuclear bomb without the radioactivity of the nuclear bomb. And the third reason I said to Jim Jones, well, if Iran would become nuclear, no doubt that would pose an existential threat to Israel. This is a regime that declared from day one under Khomeini that they have an operational goal to destroy Israel. It's an unprecedented situation. It's also an Islamic Republic, Shiite that believe in Armageddon, and it's very difficult to deter. And I said, under this case, no doubt that it would be very difficult for Israelis if they would have a nuclear bomb. Although I do not believe that the day after they would have the bomb, they would use it in order to bomb Israel. They would use it in order to expand their hegemony in the Middle East and deter others from attacking them. And I don't want to be a Saudi leader or a Gulf country leader or an Iraqi leader when Iran would become a nuclear local superpower. And I asked him, so why do you expect that Israel will take those hot potatoes for the whole region or for the whole world and pay the price for that? Even a green light should not be enough for that. If you want to see something being done, and that's my recommendation, it was my recommendation in 2009, it's even stronger today. What is needed to be done is to establish a new NATO, a second NATO, an international alliance led by United States with other members, with the European countries, of course, Australia, maybe, definitely Arab and Muslim countries in the region, and also Israel. And then if Israel will be called to contribute its share, big share, with Air Force capabilities and others in order to do what is needed, if and when it will be needed, then of course Israel should contribute this specific share. The new second NATO might deter Iran. The new second NATO would prevent nuclear proliferation in the Middle East because those countries would have a nuclear umbrella of this second NATO capabilities. And the Iranians should know that this second NATO, and I'm concluding with that, the Iranians should know that this second NATO would not adopt the MAD, mutual assured destruction policy of the Cold War. They would adopt a new doctrine, which should be called IAD, Iranian assured destruction. If God forbid they would dare to use a nuclear bomb against any country in the Middle East, they will be annihilated by this second NATO nuclear alliance that is ready for that specific purpose. And that's, by the way, should be the standing of the international community today, even before signing the agreement, definitely after signing the agreement, because the agreement, by the way, I tend to believe that the agreements will be signed because the Iranians need them. And they are the best negotiators on earth. So they would sign, at the end of the day, almost any deal that will be on the table, but they would squeeze the lemon and have all the juice out of the lemon before they would sign it. Even then, we need the second NATO and the second doctrine, the IAD doctrine, be adopted by the region and the international community.
That's very interesting. I just want to turn this to Liam for a moment. This is a realistic possibility. I mean, I'm always in for things happening and making things happen, and realpolitik. A second NATO. What do you think of that, Liam?
Well, I think that it's, first of all, I agree with Michael Danby. It's very important that we go down the correct political and diplomatic routes, not least because of the need to maintain a coalition in this situation. And also and I think it's very easy when we're talking amongst ourselves here to forget how easy it would be for Israel to become isolated in this particular battle. So it needs to maintain its alliances. The main reason why I think it's possible to do that at the moment is because the Gulf nations, including the Saudis, do not want to live with regional nuclear proliferation. And of course, the point has been very correctly made that Khamenei regularly talks about himself not as being the leader of Shia Islam, but of Islam. And there's very clearly a sort of mixture, toxic mixture of the Iranian Revolution and Persian nationalism all rolled into one. The book called Reading Khamenei by Karim Sanjapur, which goes through the speeches and writings of Khamenei over 30 years. Most Western politicians would die for the level of consistency that he shows in his concern for the purity of the Islamic Revolution, his detestation of the United States, and his contempt for the existence of Israel itself, which I think will not change. And I don't frankly see it changing, even if there's a change in leadership in Iran in the short term. So therefore, you have to maintain alliances. And I think if Iran moves or gets a nuclear weapon, and I think you have to be very clear, they're a lot closer to it than they were before, and their intention to get one hasn't changed. They're playing the game on the way to getting one, They're seeing how much they can get out of everyone else up to the point they actually declare themselves a nuclear weapon state. And I think this idea that you do need to have some sort of nuclear guarantee, not necessarily, as it was said, a regional NATO or a sort of opposing nuclear capability alliance in the region, but there needs to be an external guarantee, probably from the United States, if that's the route that's being considered, that says that an attack by Iran on any other state in the region would be met with a similar response by the guaranteeing power or powers, depending what that was. I think that, you know, we can be spending all our time talking about the measures we can take to stop Iran wanting to become a nuclear weapon state. You know, all the talk that we had at the time didn't stop Pakistan becoming a nuclear weapon state. So I think you've got to be brutally realistic about that and think about what your policy of containment looks like as your guarantee. You can't fight this with one string in your bow. There needs to be a diplomatic, a military, and an economic level of response to all of these, and you can't have one without the others. Even with all of them in place, there's no guarantee that Iran won't press on. And when I look, frankly, Stuart, at Iranian behavior, there is nothing since the Iranian Revolution that convinces me in any way, shape, or form that Iran will change course. Iran is a toxic power. It's a malign influence in the region. It's poisonous to its own people, and it's threatening to regional and wider security. So let's not kid ourselves that we can get a reactivated JCPOA that can do anything other than delay Iran's ambitions. And let's think about how we contain it.
Well, one of the things that we can do, and I mentioned to the other colleagues, I think you have to go before everybody because you have a question to the Prime Minister today. I won't ask you what you're going to ask him.
No, it'll be very benign. I think we made our point yesterday.
I think your point was very well made yesterday for those who are following British politics. Interesting. But I just want to tease out a little bit more about what we can and we should be doing, the things that we can have a responsibility of. In the end, the Iranians will do what the Iranians do. How do you see the British government, the cabinet? I mean, how are they situated, if you like, on this issue? Are they up to date on it? Are they, you know, there's so many other things that go on. And I think somebody said at the beginning, you know, there's so many other things. Are we focused? Are we focused? And if not, what should we be doing here in the UK? And I'll turn to other countries in a second.
I think I've always thought it was bizarre how little prominence Iran got as an issue in the UK. It's not often talked about in the UK Parliament. It's seldom criticised in the British media. If Saudi Arabia carried out a quarter of the human rights abuses that Iran does, it would be getting a double-page spread in The Guardian every day in a special section in the Sunday Times, probably. So the lack of criticism of the Iranian regime in the UK is astonishing. I mean, the Iranians were building up ammonium nitrate for a terrorist incident in London and barely got coverage in our media. And I just give that as an open question. I've never understood why they are so often given the benefit of the doubt. It's not a focus of policy, as you say. Focus is still on the other two threats of China and Russia. And I think there is still a failure to understand how much all our enemies will be emboldened, but particularly in Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran, as a result of the debacle over Afghanistan, which is the greatest betrayal of an ally undertaken by a Western power in at least a generation. I think that we need to be much more focused on that. I think the arguments have been well made. We need to up our own diplomatic pressure and our own activity in the region. We need far more British diplomatic presence and economic presence in the Gulf, partly as a reassurance that we still have strategic engagement there, and we need to raise the salience of the issue. We do need to be talking about it. We do need to be pushing the IAEA for a report. We do need to be bringing the issue of snapback sanctions, I agree, back to the UN, albeit understanding the limitations that we will have because of China and Russia. But nonetheless, it's the right thing for us to do if we believe in maintaining the premise of international law on that. And we need to be therefore discussing, as a nuclear power ourselves, what role we would play in a security guarantee of our allies. I'm fed up saying, but global problems require global solutions. And in an era of greater interconnectivity and interdependence, and in the world in which we find ourselves today, we've got to start breaking out of our some of our mental constraints around sovereignty and recognizing the need for greater global action and greater global alliances and new global alliances to deal with new global problems. So where are we? We're behind the curve politically here, definitely in the UK. We do not, public opinion is not prepared for what I think is coming with Iran, and far too few commentators and too few politicians show an active interest in the subject in Parliament or outside.
Yeah. Sticking to the UK for a second, Mike, do you concur with Liam's view there?
I do, but I also think there is a way we can raise the issue by not just talking about the JCPOA and the nuclear issue. If you look at the repressive nature of the regime, the way that it dealt with the mass protests that took place in the winter of 2017, the early months of 2018. If you'll recall, there was absolutely a series of demonstrations and protests all over the country. And that was partly a reflection of the economic situation. Iranian regime is, I think, listed by Transparency International as one of the most corrupt in the world. Its repressive approach to different communities, it's well known. The World Bank has come out with various data about the poorly performing economy and all the rest of it. And the regime is spending, I saw an estimate, about 5% of its GDP on supporting Hezbollah and other malign organizations and what it's been doing in Syria and so on. And I think they are vulnerable in many ways economically. I'm not saying the regime is going to collapse, because they are so repressive that they will be brutal and kill lots of people in order to stay in power, as they have done with previous protests. But they are desperate to have the sanctions, the existing sanctions, lifted. And I think there are issues that could come into the public debate. We could get support on the left because of talking about the anti-trade union repressive policies of the Iranian government. And there are issues. Having been to Iran with the Foreign Affairs Committee, I was struck by this young population that was desperate for engagement with people from the rest of the world. And it was like a dynamic young society being replaced by a theocracy. And that
the problem, Mike, I'm interrupting you. The problem is you went in 2007, did you say?
Yes, yes.
Well, those young people are now middle-aged, which is part of the problem.
Yeah, but they're still repressed. They have major drug issues in the country. We've got millions
Absolutely.
of drug addicts. There is a lot of social and economic problems. It is not just about the nuclear issue. And I think if you want to engage people in this country to talk about in the UK, sorry, we're international. Talking about some of the other issues would also be, I think, a way to raise the profile and to get more interest.
Yeah, I don't
So can I just add on that, Stuart? Well, first of all, I think it underlines the point of our need to give prominence to the whole Iranian issue, including the human rights issues and the political repression that's there. I think 2008 was the moral low point of the West in recent years. If you compare what happened in Poland in 1980, 1979-80, when we were told, oh, if the American and British governments give support to Lech Walesa in Gdansk, it will only worsen their position. And of course, that was not the view taken by Thatcher and Reagan, which was we have a moral duty to support them. You compare that to 2008 and the utter silence of the British government then, the Brown government and the Obama governments, who just did not come out and give moral support to the Green movement, while we could see on our own TV screens pictures of people being beaten and shot. I think that should be a lesson to us for all time, of why we have a moral responsibility to speak out at these times. But I agree with Mike that there are other issues. Iran's got major issues around water supply. We've seen riots there as a result of that. They've got water disputes with Afghanistan. They've got water disputes with Iraq. So there are legitimate international points of pressure to come on that. We need to be maintaining the economic pressure. I actually, if I stand back a level, much as I think in the short term that there's just not much hope at all because of the grip of not just Khamenei, but the IRGC and wider Iranian society and the economy. But in the longer term, if you're taking a much longer sweep of history, I think that the Iranian Revolution is the blip in Persian/Iranian history. This is not a normal position for them to have. But as we saw in Russia, a hiccup can be a century when it comes to intellectual irrationality. So I think that we just need to be realistic about the position in which we find ourselves. We'll have limited points of pressure. We should use them where we can, but not
the limited points of pressure would be sort of bettered if we all act together. So I now turn to Australia, Michael, and of course Mark, you can come in on Australia. You've got a double.
Can I make a short comment for the last thing that Liam said? And I fully agree with his analysis, and I fully agree in reference to the possibility of a successful coup or non-successful coup in the short term. But for the long term, there might be a regime change in Iran. But Liam, I'm really concerned from that specific moment if Iran would have a nuclear capability, military nuclear capability at that specific period of time. The Iranian Ayatollahs has their own rationality. They are not irrational people. They have their own rationality. They would hesitate in using their nuclear military capability, their nuclear bombs on a regular basis. But if they would feel that this is really 2 minutes before midnight and there is going to be a change in regime, that time is the most sensitive and dangerous time for the possible use of nuclear bombs by this specific regime.
And that's not just an issue in relation to potentially in Iran. If you look at a lot of the work that's been done, the academic work on, is a stable, aggressive Russia more or less dangerous than an unstable, aggressive Russia? It's the same equation that you're really dealing with, which is why the credibility of deterrence at that point becomes the crucial element. And it's not just theoretical, but it's where I come back. It's the credibility of deterrence, and your deterrent capability is not improved if you say even if the Russians invade Ukraine, there's no way that we'll have a military response. I mean, deterrence is built up over time in terms of credibility, and as with all else in politics, your credibility will be determined by your last action, not by your last speech or your last press release, which is why Afghanistan and then Ukraine matter a great deal in terms of the power of the US-led global alliance.
So back to Michael and Australia. So I'm looking for practical. I listened carefully to what you said about the going through the diplomatic channels and making sure. But what's the talk in Australia? What's the Australian government
Australia
thinking and doing?
Almost no role with Iran, in the sense that policymakers here are having a nervous breakdown over the fact that we've just realised we're not prepared to face a serious Chinese military threat to this region and indeed to our country. The Tehran Times is making threats against Israel in a very specific way, but we've had the militant Global Times threaten to nuke various places in the north of Australia. So the concentration here is very much on China. Perhaps speaking to our American friends, I go back to the Maley-Sherman team under Blinken and Sullivan that are still running things there. I think what they do with selling Israel a couple of aerial refuelers, what they do about providing the Saudis with ability to defend themselves against these Houthi attacks on civilian centres. The one good thing in this international picture, and I agree with Boaz's idea about there being a second NATO would be good, but I think Neil identified the fact that Britain is more active in this area. We've got the Abraham Accords in the Gulf countries. So there's a de facto group of countries that have a better position on Iran than they did in the past. But we have to go through this diplomatic route to educate international public opinion. I would like to ask you all, I don't know, they withdrew from the Vienna talks after 1 hour, the second round. How can they all go back to it if these guys keep offering nothing? And eventually, the American administration must be asked to take some realistic measures against Iran by going through the diplomatic hoops at the IAEA, at the Security Council, providing their allies and friends with the means to defend themselves.
That's very interesting. Let me turn to Mark Regev. I mean, Mark, you worked, there was nobody, maybe there were perhaps one other, people working diplomatically closely with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And Prime Minister Netanyahu was very clear. I mean, in many ways, using a British likeness, that he saw himself almost as a Churchill who was alerting and telling people. And so Iran became the major piece. So I have two questions for you. One is, I mean, what happened with the American withdrawal, and listening to what Michael Danby said, I mean, how much of that was perhaps now in hindsight a mistake? And B, now you're a commentator, Mark, looking at the present Israeli government and what's going on. Are there any noticeable differences? Is there a different nuance? Is there a different way of looking at it? So I've got a couple of questions there for you, Mark.
I mean, you're right. There's a whole series of things you're asking. I think from the perspective of how we look at Iran, Netanyahu believed very firmly that you've got to keep the pressure up and you've got to use the different tools in your toolkit. In other words, you need diplomatic pressure, you need economic pressure, and you need the threat of a credible military action. If you take that off the table, you've taken a very important element out of your toolkit. It would be a mistake and not to have that. I remember I was in Britain at the time when the Trump administration took out Qasem Soleimani. And I think that was overwhelmingly embraced in Israel, that sort of action, because they thought this is the message that the Iranians actually understand. Now, obviously, we want a diplomatic solution. But if you have that threat behind you of potential military action, I think that augments diplomatic pressure, economic pressure. When one criticizes the previous American administration, and they do deserve criticism on all sorts of issues, the fact is, had they been re-elected, then to say that maximum pressure was a failure, we don't know that. We don't know that it was a failure. Biden came in and it was clear that the pressure was off. They had a different approach, this new administration. They wanted a deal. They said they want a stronger and longer deal, yes? I don't understand, maybe I limit intelligence, yes, but I don't understand how you get a better deal if you take the pressure off. In other words, at least the administration used to be saying, let's go back to the 2015 deal and then we'll negotiate a better one. Because they admit that the 2015 deal wasn't good enough. But then once again, if you take the pressure off them, why would the Iranians ever agree to go for a deal that's more constraining on them? In other words, if you want a good diplomatic deal with Iran that actually does block their path to the bomb, then you have to be willing to use the pressure, and you've got to use all the tools in your toolcase. Now, the one talks about, it's been in the news lately, the government here, it's been leaked, is now investing more resources in the possibility of a military strike. There used to be something, and Boaz, I'm sure, has taught this at the Reichman University, there used to be something called the Begin Doctrine, which said that Israel will just not allow any of our adversaries to develop nuclear weapons. And it goes from his 1981 attack on the Iraqi nuclear reactor, and then, of course, Ehud Olmert, it was a secret for a while, but now we can talk about it publicly, hit the Syrian nuclear reactor, the one that Bashar al-Assad was trying to build near Deir Azur. It has to be remembered historically that in 1981, Begin had to deal with a lot of opposition. There were people in the Israeli government at the time who were against that attack. Famously, Shimon Peres was against the attack. The head of military intelligence was against the attack because they said, maybe correctly, they said the best you can do in a military attack is stall Saddam Hussein. You can hold it back 2, 3, 4, 5 years. In the end, after the 1981 attack, he was trying to reconstitute his program, but then came the Gulf War and it finished forever. What I'm trying to say here is that if you say, is a military solution in itself a total solution? Of course not. Can military pressure be used to buy time or to augment diplomacy? Definitely. And then what we can't talk about and what we won't talk about is, of course, what about all the so-called stellar things that go on? The so-called cyber attack those rings about in the different newspapers. How effective have those policies been, once again, in pushing back the threat of an Iranian nuclear attack? Nuclear program.
I was saving that question for Boaz for a bit later, but we can come on. I noticed somebody's written on the chat. And I'm going to refer this to Mike and Liam. Somebody's written a question, said, if all other options were off the table, would the UK take part in a joint military action against Iran? Mike Gabes.
That's a very difficult question. Given the British government's mixed involvement in various international activities in recent years, and the controversies and the votes in Parliament over Syria, for example, the 2013 debate in Parliament with David Cameron was Prime Minister, the perceived failures of what happened with the intervention in Libya, clearly the disastrous consequences of the 20 years in Afghanistan and a precipitate withdrawal and what's that? I'm really not sure. I mean, I'm not in Parliament anymore. I mean, Liam may have a better take on it, but I suspect under this current Labour leadership, there would be more support on the Labour benches than there certainly would have been in the previous one. But I don't know what the equation would be in Britain generally, but I think Michael referred earlier to preparing the ground with public opinion, and frankly, I think we're a long way from having public opinion engaged on the importance of this issue generally. So I just don't know.
Mike, you may not be in Parliament, but you're still a master of sort of British understatement that comparing this particular Labour leadership with the previous one. But Liam, I turn it to you. And I repeat the question, if all other options are off the table, would the UK take part? or support maybe a joint, a joint, and I'm emphasizing the joint military action?
I hesitate to give a direct answer to that question because these things get listened to, and you don't want to do anything that undermines any potential concept of deterrence. But I would say that at the moment, the diplomatic and political ground is not laid domestically. It's not laid internationally. We've not been through the IAEA Security Council route. There is no question of regional alliances, never mind nuclear underpinning by external powers of such alliances. So we're a very, very long way from that. And I would have said,
is the reason for that because, well, all the reasons we talked about of not being ready, or can it be suggested that it's the clever negotiating skills, if you like, of the Iranians?
If you actually believe that British public opinion is in a place now where a very cautious British government would be willing to go out on a limb, given all the things that we've talked about, then I'm afraid you're on a different planet than I am.
I wanted to feed in also the stuff that Mark Regev was talking about, and the efforts, or it seemed to be, that we read about to undermine. How are these, in your estimation, been doing? Oh, hello.
Yeah, I think that okay. First of all, I agree with the analysis of Mark, the historical analysis of what previous Israeli governments have done based on this Menachem Begin doctrine. I think that the situation now is totally different. It's not one nuclear facility that with a surprise strike close to Israel, we can eliminate that. It's a different ballgame altogether, and we should not fool ourselves by making a false resemblance between those two phenomena. Furthermore, unlike what was predicted, if things will go wrong with Syria and Iraq, which would have led, at least with Syria, to a war, and that was a real risk on the table, but there is no comparison between the possible war with Syria back then to the war that Israel is going for sure to suffer, with no question marks, if and when Israel would decide to attack Iran. Yes, pushing back was a strategy of Israel, might be a strategy in the future, but we need to calculate the price for pushing back Iran to 1 or 2 or 3 years backwards, and this is unprecedented price that we would have to pay. I want to add another comment to our discussion, and I would say, look, we are speaking in a calm surrounding situation. We learn about the hesitation of the British government. We know how the deterrent image of United States have been deteriorated in the recent decade, I would say. It started with Obama and his position towards Egypt and friendly Arab countries during the so-called Arab Spring. It went on with President Trump himself that had a lot of hot hair with no real determination whatsoever. We can mention so many examples: the shooting down the drone, attacking the Aramco facilities in Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth. A tiger paper, by all means. And we can add now Obama with the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, not the decision itself, but the way it was conducted, and the fact that the United States didn't even retaliate when American bases were attacked in Iraq not long ago. Definitely the image of United States is not has nothing to do with deterrence. And it seems that they are very weak. And you know, the Iranians can smell weakness, and they do smell the weakness. And that's why they play the cards in that harsh position. And we know that Raisi regime is even more dogmatic than the previous one. Having said all of that, as I said before, I would say it in a typical Israeli rudeness, we are recorded, read my lips, a deal will be signed.
We're reading your lips. Now I need to turn to Alan Howe.
Let me just say one thing, actually, Stuart. I said all of that in order to say that the time is of essence now, and the situation is negative. If this international alliance will not be built now, it will not be the international community will not be able to build that in the future. You know why? Because few elements that are possible partners in this second NATO, and I refer to the UAE, I refer to the Gulf countries, are now dropping United States, and they are sending delegations to Tehran because they start to feel that they bet the wrong horse. Time is of essence, and this needed to be done now because they won't be able to create this alliance in the future.
I don't disagree. So I'm going to turn to Alan Howe, who apparently has got some questions from the audience. It'd be useful, Alan, to know where the questioner is in the world. Alan, over to you.
Okay. Because of the time difference, they're mostly from Australia. But I'd like to speak to Mark Regev. I've not spoken to Mark for a few years. Good to hear your voice again, Mark. The common sense and logic and history would support the Begin doctrine that you just mentioned. And when it comes to Iran, the Iranian nuclear deal, was it not flawed from the start by having a use-by date?
The answer is, of course, yes. And that was the Israeli criticism from the very beginning, that at best, you could say that the 2015 agreement postponed the problem, that it kicked the can down the road. It didn't deal with the problem. And that became very apparent later because it left Iran with the infrastructure in place that when the regime decided, let's move very aggressively to enrich uranium, they could do so. As we argued in Israel that it was important to deny the Iranians that capability, that if they want to have nuclear power for peaceful purposes, which is in itself a very interesting question, because why does a country so rich in fossil fuel decide that it wants to have so much nuclear energy? You have to presume that the Ayatollahs are the most green, they're like Greta in Sweden, yes? But if one doesn't presume that, why are they doing all this? What's the goal of their program? It's for nuclear weapons, and we have to stop them doing. They don't need enrichment. Most countries that have nuclear energy, most countries that use nuclear energy for generating electricity, let's say, they don't have their own enrichment. You only need enrichment if your purpose is a bomb. And we think that was one of the President Obama's classic mistakes, that he agreed to give the Iranians enrichment after the UN Security Council was previously on the record saying that they shouldn't have that right to enrich. I was surprised myself, and I remember showing it to Netanyahu. There was the biography written by Burns about the diplomacy with Iran. It's called The Backtrack, I think. And he talks about in the first meeting between Iranians and Americans in the Gulf, he received instructions from the president already to tell them, yes, we accept your right to enrich. I think, classic mistake. You don't, in the first round of negotiations, to make such a serious concession, whether you should make it at all, it's another issue. But yes, in our opinion, the original deal was flawed. Often, if you're just another 30 seconds, and I apologize for monologuing here, but often the deal is criticized for what it left out. And other people on the panel have talked about it. It didn't talk about missiles, it didn't talk about terrorism, it didn't talk about regional aggression. All that is true. But don't presume from that the deal actually was good on the nuclear issue. It was not good on the nuclear issue. And that can't be forgotten.
Stuart, I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave.
Yeah.
I'm afraid.
Do you want to give us a last word?
Yes, I'd just like to add to that I entirely agree with what Mark has said. I would say it was actually even worse than that, because it gave Iran a postponement not a dead stop to the program, but worse than that, it did it while giving Iran lots of money. And the fact that Iran got everything up front just for a signature, they didn't have to earn by their behavior any of the reductions in sanctions or the payment of monies being held back for them. Iran, it was for them, I think it was a terrific deal. They got an end to the coalitions, the international coalition's demand that they didn't create a nuclear weapon, just that they delayed creating one. And as a result, they also got the bonus of a great deal of financial assistance. Their negotiators must have been really proud of themselves. I think it was a grotesquely poor deal on our side, and I think that Mark's put his finger on where a lot of the blame for that needs to lie. But thank you very much.
Well, just before you go, just thanking you, Liam, and just remember that it is the season of goodwill, and I hope you have a good Christmas. But in so doing, be kind to the Prime Minister in half an hour. He needs a bit of support.
Seasonal goodwill is a relative term, and if you're in the House of Commons bear pit, it has a slightly different meaning there than it might have elsewhere. So, but and likewise to all of you. It's lovely to see you.
Thanks, Alan. I think Michael Danby wanted to come in. I can see your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart.
Yeah,
we're not in an international marketplace. It's not a shook. Surely we have to call an end to this Vienna process. I mean, the Germans, the French, and Britain have expressed their doubts about the Iranians' behaviour. Surely we have to ask the Americans to end this and go on to the next process. As Byers says, the time is short, and if we're going to put into place the IAEA, the Security Council, continuing military pressure, and perhaps some espionage or whatever is happening there, there's only a limited amount of time that this can be effective before the Iranians cross the threshold. So please, an end to Vienna, and our American friends Malley, Sherman, Blinken, and Sullivan should be asked to, that traditional Jewish expression, "Nu, what's next?"
Yeah, no, absolutely.
An end to Vienna, please. Enough.
No, well, I won't give my own opinion, but I agree with you, Michael. Alan, do you want to come in with more questions from the floor, or do you want me to carry on?
Yes, please, Stuart. In fact, I was going to ask Liam this question. As chair, I will ask you yours. The Iranian nuclear deal, at its most basic level, it's always been blackmail, has it not?
You're asking me?
I am.
The Iranian nuclear, well, I just think the Iranian nuclear deal was a sham from day one. And from my point of view, it, and Liam and others touched on, and Mark at the end, for me, and I've been on record saying this in Parliament here, it just gave a free pass for Iran to act in the region and elsewhere, because whilst it was allegedly just concentrating on a very small, very important, massive, of course, but a very focused, narrow on the nuclear issue alone, it gave a free pass for Iran to do everything it's done. I mean, it's taken Australia a little time to ban Hezbollah in full.
At last.
You only have to do it because of what Iran is doing and Iran is sponsoring. I actually am slightly more optimistic than everybody around the discussion, because I actually think in the end the young people that Mike told, the children of the young people he talked about from 2007. In the end, this is all unsustainable. They can't continue. And I can't remember who mentioned the drug problem, but the drug, I think Mike, you did. And the drug problem is horrendous over there. From a purely human point of view, things need to be done. And again, and my last point, because you're not here to hear my views, but my last point is one the region and the Abraham Accords and the possibilities going forward. And I think that coalition that Michael was talking about is entirely possible, and Boaz was talking about, because of the new situation. The new situation is, I still pinch myself that, I was sitting in the kosher restaurant in the Armani Hotel in Dubai, having a discussion about Torah with a Muslim cleric and a rabbi, eating in a kosher restaurant. And I was up in Manchester, which is a very large Jewish community, and I was very happy to tell them that there are more kosher restaurants in Dubai than there are in Manchester, which is true. But the point is, I'm more hopeful that this coalition of countries will pressurize, I think, the Americans, and I hope they do, to move in the right direction. To follow Michael's point, get them out of Vienna and start doing something positive. So I'm more open. The one bit that I still haven't quite got hold of, if I may just come back to Mark Regev, is, and bearing in mind, Mark, I repeat, you're a commentator now, you're not speaking for a government, is where are the nuances, where are the differences in this new Israeli regime, if there are?
So the Israeli press has reported, I don't know this firsthand, but as a commentator, I can tell you the Israeli press has reported that Bennett over the last few weeks has gone closer to the traditional Netanyahu position, while it is said that the defense establishment, Benny Gantz, wants to try to make, deal this more quietly and effectively with the Americans behind closed doors. So he was just in Washington last week, and the headline that was leaked from his visit, not by us, by the other side, it was by an American official to Reuters, said that the Americans and the Israelis are going to start joint military exercises on an attack of Iran. In other words, so we'll be prepared if there's necessary to do so. Now, Stuart, you know me, I'm a bit of a cynic. I think, and here I agree with Boaz's analysis, that there's going to be a deal. And this is just part of the negotiating process. This is the Iranians are playing hardball, so the Americans are playing hardball. They're using the threat of Israel to try to get a deal, maybe. It's almost as if we don't want a deal, we have to presume the Iranians are idiots, because they won't agree to the sort of things that the Europeans and the Americans appear to be willing to agree to, which would seem to be very good for the Iranians and for the future of their nuclear program. For people who don't want to see Iran get nuclear weapons, it will not be good news.
Boaz?
Yes. Well, I don't think that there is much difference between the two administrations in Israel. I don't think that Bennett is coming closer to so-called previous position of Netanyahu. And I have to say that there are people in Israel which are toying with the idea that Israel, under any specific circumstances, might attack Iran without American support, without American green light. This is nonsense. It's impossible. Well, you can talk about that, you can threaten, you can try to deter by toying with this idea, but Israel is incapable, in my view, to attack Iran effectively without American operational support. We talked about the specific bombs, we talked about the fueling in the air, and so many other facilities which Israel need in order to conduct an effective offensive strike. Israel cannot deal without the Americans in defending Israel after the attack. Israel would need the Tamir rockets being produced in United States for the Iron Dome, and without that, it would be a chaotic situation in Israel. Israel is incapable without getting the American international support. We heard, I think it was from previous speakers, about the condemnations that Israel would face internationally wise. Without American diplomatic support, it would not happen. Therefore, any idea that Israel would attack Iran without American support and green light, it's really has no merit whatsoever, in my view.
Okay, thank you. Alan, back to you.
Yeah, Boaz, while we've got you, when we're talking about a deal or a renewed deal on Iran and its nuclear position, ultimately it's trusting the Ayatollahs. And why would anybody do that?
Thank you for asking, Alan. I have to say that I have a little different view than Stuart and Liam, in my view, because I was against the JCPOA, like them. But if you ask me what is worst, the lack of any deal with Iran or the JCPOA, I think that the situation after the American decision to step out of the nuclear deal was much worse than the nuclear deal itself, as far as I know. And I have to say that I was surprised because I predicted differently. The Iranians didn't cheat during the period of time that the deal was active. I expected differently. At least I didn't see any proof. Even the archive that Israel was getting, which proved, and as the previous speaker said, that from day one they don't have peaceful intentions in reference to their nuclear enrichment. It's definitely aimed for military intentions, no doubt about it. But that is true and was proved with the archive. The previous time before stepping out of the nuclear deal. So it was a bad deal. It was better than the situation afterwards. Now, as I believe...
Can I interrupt you, Baz? I just want to be clear. Yes. What you're saying. You're saying to me that the period of time from 2015 to 2018, you believe that Iran were doing everything by the book.
I don't have any proof to say differently. If you would ask me in 2015, 16 or 17 in private talks between us, I would tell you, I'm sure that they're deceiving the world, but we don't have proof for that. Until this very moment, I don't have the proof for that. And I'm eager to get this proof, but until I'll have it, I take it under the assumption that they didn't cheat the world. The question, of course, what would be the nature of the new deal that I believe that will be signed? It would be even worse than the previous one, no doubt in my mind. It will be signed and it would be even worse than the previous one. Iran would become a threshold nuclear militarized local superpower in a short period of time. And we have to prepare ourselves to that situation unless the international community would decide to attack their efforts now as we speak, and I don't see this coming. We heard Liam. We know who's sitting in the White House today. It would not happen. I don't see Israel doing that. So let's start to prepare to the day, unfortunate day, that Iran will be at least a threshold nuclear military regional power, and let's prepare ourselves for that situation.
So, in terms of the pressure that people have talked about on Iran, we've been self-congratulating with Australia banning Hezbollah in full, Britain finally doing Hezbollah a year and a half ago, and now doing Hamas. I was a little bit cheeky, and I said to the Prime Minister last week, I said, well, we've done Hezbollah, we've done Hamas, and he said, well, that's fine. Well, I said, well, maybe, but what about the Iranian Revolutionary Guard? And he didn't look at me as if to say that would be very easy. Can I have a view of the people here about Western action against the Iranian Revolutionary Guard? Mike Gabes.
Well, it depends what you mean by action. They, of course, have huge economic role within the Iranian state, and various institutions. They are not just a revolutionary guard. Their tentacles are everywhere. So the
By the way, I'm interrupting you for a sec, but that's what they said about Hezbollah and Lebanon, but we still were able to move on. But I know they're not the same. I know they're not the same.
I'm trying to make the point that you said action, and you can take action in many different ways. You can ban people from coming to the country. You can put them on sanctions lists individually. You can deal with companies or institutions and so on. And I suspect if there is no deal, those kind of measures can be taken. Of course, if there is a deal, presumably the Iranians will not agree to any deal that undermines the interests of the ruling IRG or the key people. And as was said by Boaz, they will effectively pocket the breaches that they've carried out between 2019 and now, and want any deal, even if it is a longer deal, to effectively permit and allow and in a sense put into law the things that they have done recently. So I was a supporter of the JCPOA, but my instinct at the moment is that to coin a phrase, no deal is better than a bad deal.
I've not heard that anywhere, Mike.
No, so I that's how I feel, given the pattern of behaviour that goes on in Syria and elsewhere, and the missile attack in Saudi Arabia, etc.
Sure. Well, let me turn to Mark Regev. I mean, on the point of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, I mean, not asking. I mean, were there discussions on this issue, perhaps while you were here in the UK, or to your knowledge?
So when I was in the UK, we were happy with progress that had been made on Hamas and on Hezbollah, correct? Or Hezbollah first and then Hamas in the UK, and that was the focus. But there's no doubt that you're right when you say who are the Revolutionary Guards? They're like Saddam Hussein's Republican Guards, or like the SS, Waffen-SS was in Nazi Germany. They're the ideological tool of the regime. They're the loyalists, and they're also, because they are at the center of the regime, they have a lot of economic influence. As was said by, I think, Mike, they run companies, they control money flows, very, very influential. I think if one wants to talk about putting pressure on the regime, so putting pressure on the Revolutionary Guards is probably a pretty good idea.
Well, as you're nodding your head, is this something which should be part of the armory?
It's a British way of saying here.
But did you think that? But Baz, will it? I'm always a great believer in sort of having goals and trying to reach them. Is that, if you have an unrealistic goal, all that does is disappoint everybody. Is this something that ought to be talked about, pushed at this stage?
I actually agree with the previous two speakers, with Mike and Mark. Although I said I do believe that an agreement will be signed, I do hope that it won't be signed, because at that specific period of time, I do agree that a lack of agreement is much better than having a bad deal, even worse than the JCPOA. And if it would not be signed, then specific steps needed to be taken along the lines of what Mark was mentioning in reference to the Revolutionary Guards, the Quds Force, in reference to the regime itself, the assets itself, and this should go hand in hand with the effort to establish this international coalition that I think might have a deterrent factor on the Ayatollah's regime.
How important do you think the role of the UAE can be going forward? I mean, it seems to me, I've been reading the last 2 days that the UAE are having conversations in Tehran of course, they're looking both ways. Now, it seems to me that might be just a new avenue, which may have bear fruit in the end. I don't know what the panel think of that.
Stuart, first of all, let me say that I believe that Israel was the only benefactor of the American weakness in the recent decade, because the Abraham Accords is mainly, in my view, an outcome of the understanding of the Gulf countries and especially the UAE, that the big brother is not that big and it's not that determined to protect them if and when they would find themselves in distress. And I refer to United States. That's why they were looking for another big brother. And Israel seems to be a smaller brother, but still a very strong one. And that's why they prefer that. But as time passes, and as they see the international attitude towards Iran, as they assess that this agreement, the new agreement, will be signed, and this would funnel a lot of money again to Iran and make it easier for them to do the subversive activity in the region and use terrorism and use their proxies in Iraq, in Yemen, and so on and so forth, they start to be concerned and they say to themselves, why should we tie ourselves to the American axis? We can, if not be part of the axis of evil led by Iran, at least be kind of neutral. So I think that the positive trend that we had with the UAE in the recent few years is now not going to be opposite, but it's going to change. We already see that they are much less vocal in their statements, calling others to sign peace with Israel. They used to be much more vocal on that. In the last 2 years, you don't hear a UAE spokesperson trying to preach to others to join them in signing peace with Israel. I think that those are bad signs that we need to take under considerations.
It's interesting. I hadn't picked any of that up. Michael Danby, do you have a view on the UAE's role here? You're unmuted.
It's all good. The UAE's role, even Saudi Arabia's role, etc., is positive. I must say, I regret the murder of Khashoggi in that embassy, etc. But I also look at the wider picture of enhancing of democratic and economic reforms in Saudi Arabia, and I think a more realistic government in the United States would have a view of that too. And of course, that determines the Americans' lack of support for the Saudis having the ability to defend themselves. We've left out of this picture with Iran the Russians, and Mr. Putin seems to have a better view of this in Syria with the way he doesn't interfere with Israeli attacks on Iranian sites. That's a good thing. Maybe he's cautious about Iran developing a nuclear weapon and the danger to Russia. I mean, after all, some of those missiles can hit Moscow that the Iranians already have. So I don't understand why Byers is so strongly believing that there's going to be a deal reached on this. Is there, the second round has been cancelled? Is there any sign that they're going back to this? And if there isn't, the British government, the Australian government, the German government and the French government should pressure the Americans to call an end to this this marketplace. The endless negotiations with the Iranians with indeterminate goals is benefiting them the whole time. They just build up and build up and build up and tantalise us with, sorry to use an Australian expression, but bullshit offerings. And we progress no further. We should be pressuring the Americans to get a report out of the International Atomic Energy Agency, who are already agitated about this. And we won't get a good result at the Security Council, but we will do what Mike Gates has been suggesting. We'll start developing international public opinion that who is at fault with all of this.
I don't
So-
want to disagree with
Stuart.
anything you've said. I don't want to disagree with anything Michael said, although I would take issue that bullshit was probably British rather than Australian.
Stuart,
but
let me
Boaz.
add a short answer and a short comment to Michael and explaining why I think an agreement will be signed. Because what you see now, Michael, in Vienna, it's a Persian bazaar negotiation. That's it. And that's the way we need to understand that, not look at that in Western binoculars. That's the way negotiation is being conducted by the Iranians. They close the doors, they break the discussions, but at the end of the day, if they have an interest, they would return and they would sign, and they have an imminent interest in this agreement, and that's why I think it would be signed. I started with an anecdote, I would finish with an anecdote. In 2015, I was invited to a closed forum under Chatham House rules, so I won't mention the names of the people there, but this was a group of really the chief negotiators with Iran in Geneva. And this was few months before they signed the deal. And they shared with me and few of my colleagues the discussions that have been conducted in closed doors. And sincerely, they said, we are not sure. Actually, we don't think that we would sign an agreement. They are tough negotiators. It's very difficult to negotiate. And we are very pessimistic that an agreement will be signed. And what I said then, I say now, I said, read my lips, you are going to sign an agreement because the Iranians need that desperately. It was true then. I think it was true today, and that's why I don't like the deal. I think it would be a very bad deal, but we need to prepare to that situation, in my view.
Stuart, can we ask one last question, please?
Well, I was just about to call you. One last one. Yes.
Okay, to Mike Gapes, if I can. He mentioned earlier the possible vulnerability of the Iranian regime. Now, a young man in 2010, disgruntled by his treatment by the local council, set fire to himself outside a petrol station, outside a police station, and caused the Arab Spring, as we know it, in Tunisia. A year before, a young woman, Nida Sultan, was accidentally shot dead in an uprising against the election protest, basically, in Iran. This was caught on YouTube. This young man who killed himself in Tunisia was not filmed or photographed. We had no idea what he looks like. This young woman's accidental shooting was filmed. Her death was filmed. It was on YouTube, was live. It was seen by millions of people in Iran. But nothing really advanced from there. Does that suggest that the Iranian regime is quite resilient?
I think it's what we've all been talking about up to now. The IRGC and the various arms of the Iranian state. We all know about the difference between the supreme leader and the president and the parallel structures. And if you negotiate with the foreign minister, you are not really negotiating with the people who are actually making the decisions of controlling the state. I think the regime is going to be very difficult to overthrow or transform because of the nature of that regime. But that doesn't mean that there won't be protests. It doesn't mean that there aren't strikes, that there aren't young people who are engaged in various daily acts of defiance. And there are brave people, many of whom have had to flee into exile, others who have died, others who are in prison, who continue to have a different vision of Iran. But I don't think anybody expected when those things happened in Tunisia in 2011 that you've talked about. We didn't expect what happened subsequently, and certainly, and as it's turned out, it was not as optimistic. In fact, in many senses, the situation is worse in many of those countries today than it was at that time. I just don't know. I'm not an expert on Iran. I've only been there the once. I've talked to people and I've read, but my impression is that the regime has a lot of power, and the danger, of course, of any deal, when it gets more money, then it has got more resources when sanctions are lifted for its own malign purposes. At the same time, if you want to transform a society, you really need to get it to engage more with the rest of the world rather than forcing it down. And this is the dilemma that we face. And maybe there will be a deal, or maybe it will lead to a transformation in time. But I don't envisage any quick changes in the nature of the Iranian regime.
Well, I'm looking at my watch, and I in football parlance, we're now into extra time, and and I know a lot of goals can be scored in extra time, but I think it's incumbent on me to thank Albert for bringing us all together again, and of course now to thank the distinguished panel. Maybe, Albert, you ought to think of suggesting to the powers that be that if they want some sort of deal done with the Iranians, you get a team led by Mark Regev, Mike Gates, Boaz Ganor, Michael Danby and Liam Fox out there, and who knows what could happen. But I think what we have witnessed today is a very interesting, fascinating discussion.
Led by Stuart Pollack. Don't forget.
No, but I'm just the captain of the team, just pushing you in the right direction and so forth. But I think that this is has been really valuable, very interesting. We're going to have to watch this space, and I think we're all in the same boat that in some way or other we hope that the Iranians decide to look in the right direction and start moving towards peace. And my last word is actually to you, Boaz. I strongly believe that what's happening with the UAE, and let's not forget Bahrain, you know, Mark Regev will tell us that his former deputy is now the Israeli ambassador in Bahrain, and Bahrain would not have come to the table without the Saudi Arabians and agreeing. Morocco has come on board. There is a momentum, irrespective of whatever statements are being made. The train has left the station, and we just need to encourage others to join that train and move on. And I do believe that we are moving into positive territory in that respect, which can put that added pressure on the Iranians. So in concluding, thanking everyone and wishing everybody, I hope you all had a nice Hanukkah, but a Merry Christmas and a very healthy 2022. Thank you, Albert, again, and I call this excellent session to a close. Thank you all.
Thanks, Stuart. Good job.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, everyone.
Cheers.